guys? It's Two Guys in Hockey Talk. I'm Pawel, and
I'm Evan. How you doing, Pawel?
I'm doing all right. It's been a while since we've been together, Evan. I felt like we weren't getting our one-on-one time. I kind of missed it.
Well, all those guys are stealing the love. Hey,
And
just
I see you're wearing the Toronto Maple Leafs jersey. Clearly, they destroyed Edmonton, so you're trying to hurt my feelings, right? Except I'm not a Oilers fan. I'm a Philly fan. Right? So let's remember that.
And that takes me back into the late 70s, the Philly Toronto games, man. I remember sitting up late at night with the parents.
Oh yeah. And speaking of the Philadelphia Flyers, well, you know that Ron Hextall has moved over to being the GM of the Pittsburgh Penguins, and you got Berkey coming out of out of Hockey Night in Canada to be the president of Hockey Ops.
Yeah, it's so. Let's quickly. We have a special guest coming on in just a little bit here. Why don't we quickly have an armchair GMing? Just you and me, really quick. We got about 3-4 minutes for our followers out there. We got a great guest that is lined up, is coming on in just a couple minutes. So, what do we do if we are Brian Burke and Ron Hextall? Doesn't matter who does what or plans. How are you going to take this team, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and get another cup out of them before Crosby retires?
What I say is you got Crosby and Malkin, like two elite players. You've won 3 cups with those guys, and you've got Chris Letang. The one thing that I think they're struggling a little bit with is injuries. So if this team isn't injured, do you think they can go to the promised land? I think they have a way to get a shot to get there as close as possible. But they need that little tweak. What does that mean? I think they need a good, solid defenseman.
Okay.
I don't want to say Pietrangelo, but something like that where you can get. And I don't agree with the Mike Matheson trade for Patrick Hornquist. I think that was a bad trade. But that was done to Rutherford. So my inkling is if Hextall can go and make a solid trade with a team that has a defense core that they don't need, they can get rid of a player. That's my thoughts. You, Evan?
So let's think through this just a little bit really quickly. So the Pittsburgh Penguins, I got some data here listed up on my screen here. So listen to this. They did not pick a first-round pick in 2013. We're going to talk about first-round picks here in a little while with our special guest. 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2020, no first-round draft pick. No wonder they're struggling right now. And interesting, since where is it? It's got a handful on my. I think since 2015, none of their players that they've drafted since 2015 have entered the NHL. Their drafting department definitely, while it was a gem in days past, it's not anymore. And so here's the big question. So we got Crosby for another 4 years past this year. So this year plus 4 more, 2015, 2016. So you got his time in here. You only got 2 more years after this with Malkin, I believe, and you only got 1 more year with Letang. Do you try to find a way to salvage someone looking for a cup run, maybe to get Letang out and get something in? But you need something now because a prospect right now is not going to – they don't need a prospect. They need a player.
So rumblings around the NHL was that the reason Rutherford was let go or there was a difference in side is because he had an idea for a trade with Letang. Now, I can't confirm the sources, but that was kind of what they were going for. So I don't know if Letang is going anywhere given the ownership there with Mario Lemieux. And, so we'll see if that actually takes place. I do, however, think they have some pieces that they could trade away to getting another top defense guy, a top 4 guy. And I think they can make a run. I really do.
So something interesting has been heating up interesting enough. I don't see this happening this season. I think because of Vegas situation. Things have heated up, and some different groups, the rumors are coming out that the Flower could be returning at the end of the year in some package where they give a little relief to so in other words, Vegas gets a relief to unload the cap because of the Kraken situation, because they got 2 goalies that they cannot they have to protect both, but you're not allowed to protect 2 goalies. So they're going to be in a desperate situation. So will there be a potential? Because I think Pittsburgh needs a goalie. They need a goalie that's consistent. And they thought they had it, and then they let him go.
Yeah. But Fleury's about 4.5 million. And I know that one of the reasons they couldn't trade him this year is because Vegas didn't want to retain any salary because they had some interest, but didn't pan out. So yeah. I would love to see the Flower return. I think he'd be great. I love the guy. He's got a smile on his face. He's like TJ Oshie out of Washington, just always such a happy go-getter, right? Like he's never in a bad mood. He's not gonna get along with Berkey at all. He's gonna be like the Team Solane for Berkey.
Well, I'm really interested when they get ready to host their first game with fans in Philadelphia. When Ron Hextall led Pittsburgh Penguin team, he already left with bad blood. So this is going to be an interesting one. Well, we better get going. We got to get into our next sector. Why don't you go ahead and introduce our next guest?
For sure. We've got the illustrious Mike Smith, not the guy between the pipes, but a very local old Mike Smith who is joining us. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm good. Good to be here, guys. Thanks.
Thanks for coming on. Evan, we have a special guest. He's going to share some stuff. Mike, what brings you to hockey? Where's your passion at with hockey? What made you fall in love with the game?
Well, like you guys, right? Growing up in Canada is kind of front and center for everything, right? And I grew up in the Maritimes, and my dad was a huge Bruins fan and despised Montreal. Loved Bobby Orr. And I just became a Bruins fan, and fortunate for me, they had a pretty good run, and then a lot of suffering from about the mid-'70s to 2011. So,
yeah, they're a pretty solid team. You got the perfection line with Bergeron, who's just recently been named captain. Your thoughts on that? Do you like that choice?
Yeah, Bergie is. I mean, Pasta's all obviously waiting in the wings, but Bergie served his time behind Chara. Justifiably so, and I think it's a new time, but a young Pasta, elite offensive player on the team. It's almost like a bonus time for me. Still leaving off the 2011 Cup wins, so still fun times to be a Bruins fan for sure.
And Pasta with the goal. I didn't know we referred to him as Pasta. I'm gonna have to be using that. Anyway. All right. Well, Mike, why don't you break down, maybe tell everyone a little bit about what your project and the things you've been working on and stuff like that?
Sure. So my background is I manage analytics projects, and so I come by it honestly. And so I was doing an online project through the University of California, Davis, and I needed a capstone project. And I thought, I could do something really meaningful, climate change, et cetera. And thought, what, why don't I have some fun with this? And so I wanted to dig into draft data and the NHL entry draft, and it's an itch I wanted to scratch for a long time. And so, the capstone project really didn't even feel like work. It was a lot of time, et cetera. But I went into this project really with two goals, and that was to try to figure out, which organizations draft the best, and then B, which leagues produce the best talent. But without getting too ahead of things here, I realized early on that, it really was about luck, was my initial hypothesis. I thought it isn't so much about incredible organizations. So it's about, where are they drafting, and are they in a good draft year? And so it caused me to sort of circle back, and what you'll be seeing today is what I ended up doing as opposed to what I was going to do at the start.
It's kind of like looking back on the Yakupov Galchenyuk year, right? Oh. Morgan Riley turns out to be the best product of the group. Definitely a little bit of luck on that year.
100%, yeah.
Speaking of luck, I think Pavel's team got a little bit of luck that year when Connor McDavid slipped from the Toronto Maple Leafs and went Edmonton's way. We're still reeling in the pain.
Okay, well, first off, it was Buffalo who was tanking for McDavid, and they literally made it known, which is why I think there's been talks about changing the draft. But Mike, what are some of the things that you found from the draft? Because we got a chance to kind of go through the research. We enjoyed it. We're hoping we're able to share this later on. with our followers, but just a little bit of thoughts on what you discovered about drafting since I believe you started from 2003, if I recall.
Yeah, and 2003, for various reasons, it I could remember that far enough back to kind of to talk about it in a very familiar way. I could remember some players back then, but a couple of things that jumped out at me was just how obvious it was that players picked early in the first round is such a better chance of having an elite offensive player, and secondly, it's quite surprising a number of players that never play a game in the NHL. And as you get deeper into the rounds, you realize, 60, 70% of players never play a game. And you're reminded that, if organizations truly were adept at drafting, I don't think you'd see that as much. They'd find a way to find those diamonds in the rough, right, on a more consistent basis. And then the other thing, of course, Evan, you mentioned Yakupov. The 2012 draft year is not the same as the 2014 with Dry or 2015 with McDavid. They're different years, and you could be picking first overall in 2012 and end up with a ham sandwich. You know what I mean? So you need to be in a good position, and you need to be lucky. And so those are kind of the cornerstones of my hypothesis into the work I did, for sure.
That's awesome. And actually, it's interesting when you're saying that, because I'm just like thinking back, and because everything in the analytics was leading up, other than the defensive prowess of Yakupov, was showing that he should have been an elite player.
100%. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Well, why don't you walk us through some of the stuff that you've discovered?
Sure. So let me share my screen here. So even as I'm opening this up, I won't get into the technical details too much, but a shout out to Ralph Slate at HockeyDB, who gave me permission to use the HockeyDB data. And he did give me a heads up that I couldn't automate any of this, or because he's kind of locked that down. So Tableau, what you're looking at right now, Tableau is just a data visualization tool. And I was able to manually scrape those data from HockeyDB, get them into an environment where I could play around with them, and then spend lots and lots of hours, probably, maybe 150, 200 hours putting this, what they call a storyboard, together. So really quickly, these are just kind of the questions I have going into this. And then with each story, I go through coming to a conclusion. And, most times with this, you'd peer review it with some really smart hockey people like yourselves. You'd beat the heck out of it, and you make some changes and come up the other end. So this is kind of early days with this, but I'd have to say that most of the hypotheses I've had, I'm feeling pretty comfortable about them. But let's go through it and to see. So these are some of the questions. The first question, does it matter where an organization drafts? Well, you can see up in the top left here that as you get deeper into the rounds, you can see such a high percentage of players that never play a game. You can see players that play 0 games, and then different ranges here. And you can see that most games come from players drafted in the first round, right? So that was something that really surprised me, that majority of players drafted after the first round and deeper just never play a game.
Something that stands out on this page too here is I notice on to the right where your points and goals by the player picked, where number 8 and number 10 are so low and interesting. We're going to be talking about this on a future roundtable, but like the Buffalo Sabres have been picking between 8 and 10 for a long time. And they've, outside of really Jack Eichel, they've really struggled.
That's a really good point, Evan. And something I landed on when you talk about the elite of the elites, even with the Oilers drafting Taylor Hall, when you compare him to the elite of the elites, right? You talk about the Malkins and the Crosbys and the Canes and the Taves, right? I mean, even with Hall, they were lucky, but they weren't that lucky, right? So That's a really good point with Buffalo and people that think just because they had high picks, they should be, crushing it. But
Yeah.
there's a reason that those top three guys have what? One even strength goal all season. So yeah, good point. And then the second bar chart here, you see, percent of games played by players taken each round. It's almost 50% for those in the first round. And not surprisingly, the percent of points scored, most of the points come from players selected in the first round. And again, it just leads credence to the fact that if it were about organizational skill, I don't think you'd see such a large discrepancy. I think you do see players picked in the second round that, diamonds in the rough, et cetera, but not as consistently as you might think.
Just brings you to wonder why people even focus so strong on third round and further down, on their draft picks.
That's a good rabbit hole, Evan. When I come to the end of this and maybe future discussions is about if a team's laying out a strategy for what they should do. You mentioned Buffalo tanking, Pavel. One of the strategies, just find a way to pick in the top three. However you have to do that, trade with Toronto or whatever the case may be. But sorry, it's a brutal.
You really also get a sense of the fact that like Steve Yzerman, who's been able to find such gems in the draft and find someone like a Braden Point, who I believe was like in the 5th or 6th round, or even when his time was in, or even our own general manager Ken Holland finding Henrik Zetterberg, right, and Pavel Datsyuk later on, and nobody expected them to be anything, and they ended up being Hall of Famers. So.
Yeah, really good point, Pavel. And that's something I hope to dig into after the fact, notwithstanding this kind of high level analysis here, is dig into, what are the outlier organizations and GMs that find a way in spite of this apparent bias, for sure. So the premise of this first story is just, it matters where you are. The higher you are in the first round picking, the better chance you're going to get a player. But even if you're in that position, what this shows is the average points per game for players picked by teams. And you can see the variability here, and this includes all players. So if I were to just clean this up a bit and just remove, say, defensemen and goalies, you can see the variability changes a little bit. And then if I were to constrain on only the first round, you can see the variability starts to change even more. And then if I were to say, well, let's just constrain on first overall pick. I mean, it just screams out at you, doesn't it, that, 2012 here, this is basically Nail Yakupov. And you compare it across, you can't ignore this, right? That which year you draft in it matters. Yeah. For generational talent. And so I know that people that watch this are saying, well, duh, that's obvious. But when you compare this to the hypothesis that, well, gosh, teams just draft players, or organizations draft players, they develop them, and away you go. This starts to refute that point. It starts to say, well, no, luck is a factor. And perhaps as I'm going to get into here next, luck can be such a factor that if you don't do it this way, you won't win Stanley Cups.
Interesting. That's good.
So this is where it gets, I'll talk through this a little bit, but so the first two were about, you want to be in a good position to draft an elite player. The second was, well, of course, in some years you're just not going to get those players. What I wanted to do was to tie that to teams that won Stanley Cups. And so what you're looking at here, I constrained on teams that have won Stanley Cups since 2003. Okay. And when you see the 4-3-2-1-0, that's just showing this was 4 years before they won, 3 years, 2-1-1, and then they won the cup. And what I wanted to illustrate here, without making it too complicated, was simply to show what do teams look like from a leading indicator leading up to the year they won the cup. And then the dark blue, what that indicates is in 2003, Anaheim drafted a player. The dark blue indicates high points per game. And people who follow Anaheim will realize that year they drafted Getzlaf and Perry. And then in 2007, they lit it up that playoff year. You know, Solani was great. Obviously, Niedermeyer and Pronger were great. But those were two elite offensive players they drafted and kept. Same with Boston. You can see they drafted and kept elite players. That was Sagan, of course, in 2010. Carolina won the cup in 2006, but what a lot of people forget is that they drafted Eric Stahl. Eric Stahl was an elite offensive player. And you could go right down through. Chicago that won 3 cups, we know those guys. Pavel, to your point, with Detroit, they drafted and kept elite players. And so you could see these dark blue indicators related to Stanley Cup players as key leading indicators towards winning a Stanley Cup.
Really neat.
So far, so good?
Yep, we're following.
And so when we now say, okay, if these are Stanley Cup winners, what about, well, let me just go back here. Now let's compare Stanley Cup winners to non-Stanley Cup winners. And so again, this is starting 2003, and I have 2000 up to 2020 here. You can very clearly see that the non-winners, they did not have any elite offensive players drafted. And again, if the hypothesis is true that you need an elite offensive player, and I've heard Gregor talk a lot about this on the radio, he's a firm believer in saying, you know, if you don't have elite players, you know, you could have solid second, third line players, you could have average offensive players, and you could even have what you'd call great goaltending. But if you don't have elite players, you're not going to win Stanley Cups.
No.
And after looking at this, I tend to agree with them. And so you can clearly see here that from 2003 through 2014, the Stanley Cup winning teams had elite offensive players. And then down here, you know, Philadelphia, I think this is Claude Giroux. The Islanders, this is probably Tavares. Edmonton, Taylor Hall. Calgary, I think this is Johnny Gaudreau, if I'm not mistaken. And then you get in Nathan McKinnon, et cetera. And all of these teams, in spite of having those players, first of all, 4 out of 21 teams had them, whereas compared to Stanley Cup winning players where everyone had them, you can start to make a good case for the elite offensive player being a primary driver for winning a Stanley Cup or not.
Interesting. I wonder how much influence coaching and a defensive team structure like the Islanders did last year, or even Ottawa Senators in 2017 versus Pittsburgh Penguins when they went to double overtime, would influence that scoring capability, because they did make it far, but you know, whether it's luck or you're saying it's that points production, do you think that would have any influence?
That's a good point, and that's where, you know, some of the data science guys, the real analytics guys, would probably pick this up and take it a step further to dig into that question, Pavel. But I think it's a really good question that would deserve some investigation, and that would get into would add some complexity, because you want to start digging into some of the coaches that were involved at the time and et cetera. But yeah, really good point. Really good question.
So, Mike, do you think that with hockey you can actually have, instead of money ball, let's call it money puck? Do you think it will actually work in hockey, or based on looking on your stats here, you still need those elite. Like one elite is probably not going to make it happen. You're going to need at least 2 or 3 elite players.
So, good question. So, give me a second here. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I'm going to share a different screen, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm going to jump over to Excel. And so what I listed here is for every Stanley Cup winner since 2003, is that question you just asked is a good one, Evan. I started asking, well, what do those teams really look like at a detail level? And so here's Jersey. They drafted Patrick Elias. They had Niedermeyer or Dewar. Yeah. Tampa drafted Richards LeCavalier. Carolina Stahl, Anaheim Getzlaf Perry, and so on down the line, right? So you can see these are really in my estimation, the key players that drove those Stanley Cup wins each year. And first, and again, this is every team, right, since 2003.
Yeah.
And I'd argue that it was the Pittsburghs that had 2 elite players. They won 3 cups. Chicago had 2 elite players. They won 3 cups. And so I think it supports your question, Evan, that, if you have a smattering of maybe another elite player with some strong support defensively, that to support your point. The more the merrier, as it were. Good. And I do think that.
Well, I believe LA took 2 cups, I believe, during their period, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
2012 and 2014. Now, I wonder, Mike, do you think, given the last history trajectory of the last 3 Stanley Cup winners with Washington, St. Louis, and Tampa, which we all know Tampa is very well deserving, given that they've been built up to being a Stanley Cup contender, but with Washington and St. Louis, could we see a repeat for any of those teams the way that Chicago, Pittsburgh, or LA did? Or do you think that it's kind of with that luck, it's open to anybody else now, like a Colorado, for example, who's in the top tier, or Vegas potentially?
It's a great question, Pavel. So I'm going to switch gears and go back to my original screen, if you don't mind. That is such a great question. And so the next dashboard I'm going to show, I'm just going to speak to it here, to your point. This bottom screen, these are, again, the non-Stanley Cup winners. If I do a couple things here, if I change the points per game to, let's say, 0.9, or let's even 0.8 is fine. And I change the draft year up so that we're focusing only, say, since about 2011. So to your point, what jumps out at you is that, from 2014 or 2013 on, Stanley Cup winners here since 2003 through 2020, there's only 2 teams, so Pasta in Boston, and then I think maybe this is Braden Point, 2014. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But look down here.
Wow.
These non-Stanley Cup winners, there's 6, 8, 10 players that were drafted that fit my original hypothesis that whereas the high elite offensive player is going to drive Stanley Cup wins. So I think, my opinion, I'd say Washington maybe is getting a little bit long in the tooth, but Tampa Bay, they still have young offensive talent. They may have contract issues, but they still have talent. Pasta is kind of continuing to keep Boston in the mix. Without him, they might be in trouble. But I really think that down here, you look at the teams that potentially could take over the next 10 years. And people like to say, well, geez, the Oilers have had only chance. Well, the Oilers really only got lucky with true generational elites with Dry and McDavid, in my humble opinion.
Yeah.
So they're and I believe, really in a position to make some noise. But one thing I'd like to show you here, this is, if I constrain on these teams, that we have up here, just for fun. Oops. So I keep them. And then to add another dimension to this, because your question, Pawel, earlier about, organizations that coach good defense, et cetera. And then I changed the position to, let's just constrain a defenseman, and then say, which teams of those have strong defensemen? So now you're making a case that, okay, these teams have 5 points per game elite offensive players, but here's some of the players that also have elite defensemen. And so people watching this is like, well, duh, of course, we all know about Colorado and Vancouver. But again, it starts to quantify that, again, if you rely upon my original hypothesis, there are only so many teams in theory that are going to be winning the Stanley Cup in the next 5-10 years.
Something that stands out to me on here is, man, you can see that Colorado is really positioned with elite. It's as far as the GM, are they going to get surrounded with the right players?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
wow.
And to your point, if you're in Vegas and you want to pick 5 teams to bet, key on a couple, that's something you have to consider. But if you argue that, unless you have those elite players, you have no shot. But then the second point is, okay, great, but are the GMs going to carry the day on getting those right players in the mix as they go through the journey towards the Cup?
Yeah.
No.
It's great work. Great work.
So this is, I think it's going to be interesting to really tighten this up and add a little more complexity from an analytics perspective to truly tighten down my hypotheses and validate them. But I think it's to a point where it makes a good case for the need for elite players. So from a conclusion perspective, I'd say, yeah, organizations need to be in a good position to draft in the right year. And it's not just drafting, but they need to keep these players. But it is interesting, since 2003, the Stanley Cup winning teams all seem to have had no problem drafting and keeping them, right from Eric Stahl through to present day. And if you don't do that, you don't win. And in my estimation, at least based upon the work I've done, it looks like it's a leading indicator. That is having elite players on your team. So,
fabulous work, Mike. Fabulous work. The question becomes, when you're looking at the drafting and stuff like that, it'll be interesting what happens in Vegas's case, because I know that they're always an odds-on favorite, but are they always the bridesmaid, not the bride, though? In other words, are they actually going to see the Holy Grail? In my opinion, I feel like I cannot go back and just think off the top of my head any team winning the Stanley Cup without an elite player, even if he's been brought in. So, but they're going to be riding that draft and see who's, some of these guys coming in, but they haven't had any draft picks that are showing even on your window here.
Well, yeah, it's a good point. And something I've been thinking about is kind of a classification for teams that win cups. And I'd argue that, Boston might be the weakest team in the last 17 years to win a cup. The 2011 team, I think the top scoring player had 57 points, and Krejci, I think, led the league at 22 points in the playoffs. But St. Louis, similar. Tarasenko's a great player, but they won with depth.
That's true.
And so I might include Vegas in that kind of smattering of teams. And Mark Stone, obviously an elite player, but he's not that elite player, right? And so it's a good question, Evan, and it'll be fun to watch, especially in a COVID year, which I think has another bearing on things, exactly how this plays out.
Well, it's going to be interesting. You're going to have to do some data in a year or two here to see what happens with the development of a lot of these young players. Like even right now, we got like the Western Hockey League started up, but we got like British Columbia still haven't made a decision yet in the Western Hockey League, where they're going to go, what's going to happen to these players. they got some that have signed down the USHL because they're playing. They need to.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Awesome.
I also like the idea from watching the last few Stanley Cups in the last year, and you can probably attest to this, Mike, with the Bruins is, they were the big bad Bruins, and a lot of the teams like St. Louis, Washington, Chicago, they were physical, they were heavy, they were pushing and grinding, they were going to the boards. And one of the things that I think also wins cups is, a bit of goalie luck, but also that physicality, which, fewer calls are made. There's the rule book for the regular season and there's the rule book for the playoffs. So,
yeah.
So are you saying Toronto's strategy is not going to work this year? Hey, come on, man. They brought in Wayne Simmons.
That's if somebody were to put a gun to my head, I'd say the Leafs look. Austin Matthews has elevated himself, and the Leafs, Colorado, and again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to pick some of these teams, but I think that those teams are in pretty good shape this year.
Yeah, I think the big thing with Colorado and Toronto is going to be, do they have a goalie that's going to take them in the playoffs to kind of fix that one part that they maybe don't, especially on the back end for Toronto, right? They're kind of going by committee a little bit more with just one almost elite. I don't know if I put Morgan Riley in the elite yet quite, but well, that's probably going to wrap up our show today, Mike. So awesome. We'd love to have you back sometime and to chat a little bit more. I'd just like to mention to everybody that our own Mike Smith here is wearing a jersey. Maybe give us the quick background story, if you could. We talked off air. Maybe give us the background story on getting your jersey signed by the team.
You bet. So it was, my sister was Peter Puck's executive assistant back in the 90s. And for those of you who don't know Peter Pocklington, of course. And I'd pop in once in a while, and she had let him know that I was a big Bruins fan. And so he talked to his buddy Harry Sinden, and a couple weeks later, this jersey showed up, and my sister surprised me, and I never wash it, of course, and so I wear it at special times like today, and so yeah, it's a story behind it.
Yeah, and awesome. just so everyone knows, this is Ray Bourque jersey.
Yeah.
And we appreciate you, Mike, for coming on and sharing everything. It was perfect. The one thing that I will criticize is you saying Evan is smart. I mean, no.
That only cost Evan $20. That was we confirmed that before.
Last show it cost me $50, so that sounds like it's going down. Well, guys, thanks again for joining us for another episode of Two Guys in Hockey Talk. In the meantime,
and in between time, keep your sticks on the ice. Take care.
Have a great one.
Good
Take
life.
care. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.